The grand ballroom of Eldoria Palace sparkled under crystal chandeliers as Queen Isabella surveyed the evening's festivities. At 62, she carried herself with the practiced grace of 4 decades on the throne, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her emerald tiara catching the light. Tonight's charity gala was meant to celebrate the kingdom's education initiatives, but Isabella's attention was drawn to a different kind of drama unfolding in the corner of the room. Princess Sophia, her daughter-in-law of 8 years, stood in animated conversation with a group of foreign dignitaries. The 34-year-old former diplomat had always been poised and articulate, but tonight there was something different about her demeanor. She gestured with unusual passion as she discussed the new literacy programs, her voice carrying across the room in a way that made several courtiers turn their heads. Isabella's jaw tightened as she watched Prince Alexander, her eldest son and heir to the throne, approach his wife with obvious concern etched on his features. At 37, Alexander had inherited his mother's strong will, but lacked her political instincts. He placed a gentle hand on Sophia's arm, whispering something that made her step back and smile apologetically to the dignitaries before excusing herself. The tension that had been building in the royal family for months was becoming increasingly difficult to hide from the public eye. It had started small, with disagreements over protocol and ceremonial duties. Sophia believed the monarchy needed to modernize more rapidly, to engage with social issues more directly. Isabella, however, valued tradition and the careful balance that had kept their kingdom stable for generations. Lady Margaret Blackwood, Isabella's closest advisor and longtime friend, appeared at the Queen's elbow. At 58, Margaret had served the crown for over 20 years and possessed an uncanny ability to read the political climate. Her dark eyes followed Isabella's gaze to where Sophia now stood with Alexander near the orchestra. "Your Majesty," Margaret murmured, her voice barely audible above the string quartet. "Perhaps we should discuss the morning's agenda. The Prime Minister has requested an audience about the education budget." Isabella nodded absently, but her focus remained on her family. Sophia had been pushing for the royal family to take more progressive stances on various social issues, from climate change to income inequality. While Isabella appreciated her daughter-in-law's passion, she worried about the precedent such activism might set. The monarchy's strength lay in its ability to remain above partisan politics, to serve as a unifying symbol for all citizens regardless of their personal beliefs. The Queen remembered her own early days as a young royal, married into the family at 22. She had made her share of mistakes, speaking too freely about her opinions, allowing her emotions to guide her public statements. It had taken years of careful tutelage from her late mother-in-law to understand the delicate balance required of a royal consort. Now, watching Sophia navigate similar challenges, Isabella felt both protective and frustrated. Prince Alexander caught his mother's eye from across the room and offered a wan smile. The strain of mediating between his wife and mother was taking its toll on the future king. He had always been close to Isabella, sharing her love of history and tradition, but his marriage to Sophia had opened his eyes to new perspectives. The conflict was tearing him in directions he had never anticipated when he proposed to the brilliant diplomat he had met at a state dinner. As the evening progressed, Isabella observed Sophia's interactions with growing unease. The princess spoke with representatives from various humanitarian organizations, her enthusiasm infectious, but perhaps too revealing. When asked about the royal family's position on refugee assistance, Sophia's response went beyond the carefully neutral statements that protocol demanded. "I believe we have a moral obligation to help those fleeing persecution," Sophia declared, her voice carrying conviction that made Isabella's stomach clench. "As a nation blessed with prosperity and stability, we must open our hearts and our borders to those in need." The statement, while heartfelt, ventured into political territory that the royal family traditionally avoided. Isabella watched as several journalists in attendance began scribbling notes, recognizing the potential headline that Sophia had just provided them. Lady Margaret's sharp intake of breath confirmed Isabella's fears. After the guests had departed and the palace had returned to its usual quiet dignity, Isabella requested that both Alexander and Sophia join her in the blue drawing room. The space, with its silk wallpaper and portraits of past monarchs, served as an informal meeting place for family discussions. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was anything but casual. Sophia entered first, having changed from her gala gown into a simple navy dress. Her dark hair, no longer pinned in an elaborate style, fell softly around her shoulders, making her appear younger and somehow more vulnerable. Alexander followed, loosening his bow tie with the weary gesture of a man who had spent too many evenings managing diplomatic crises. Isabella poured tea from the delicate china service, a ritual that usually provided comfort, but tonight felt like a formality masking deeper tensions. The Queen's hands were steady as she handed cups to her son and daughter-in-law, but her words carried the weight of accumulated concern. "Sophia, dear," Isabella began, her tone carefully modulated, "I wanted to discuss this evening's conversations. While I appreciate your passion for humanitarian causes, I'm concerned about some of the statements you made to the press." Sophia set down her teacup with deliberate care, her diplomat's training evident in her controlled response. "Your Majesty, I spoke from the heart about issues that affect real people. Surely the royal family should stand for something more than ribbon cuttings and ceremonial duties." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing the familiar signs of an approaching confrontation. He had witnessed similar discussions over the past months, each one leaving all parties more entrenched in their positions. Isabella's expression remained composed, but her eyes flashed with a hint of steel. The monarchy endures because it remains above the fray of political debate, Sophia. The moment we begin advocating for specific policies, we risk alienating portions of our population and diminishing our effectiveness as unifying figures. But remaining silent in the face of suffering isn't neutrality, Sophia countered, her voice rising slightly. It's complicity. The people look to us for leadership, not just pageantry. Alexander finally spoke, his voice heavy with the burden of divided loyalties. "Perhaps we could find a middle ground, ways to support important causes without making overtly political statements." Both women turned to him, and he immediately recognized that his attempt at diplomacy had satisfied neither side. Isabella saw compromise as weakness in the face of established protocol, while Sophia viewed it as an inadequate response to urgent moral imperatives. The conversation continued for another hour, with each participant retreating further into their established positions. Isabella spoke of duty, tradition, and the careful balance that had preserved the monarchy through centuries of political upheaval. Sophia argued for relevance, moral leadership, and the need to evolve with changing social expectations. Alexander found himself caught between two worldviews that seemed increasingly irreconcilable. As the clock struck midnight, Isabella rose from her chair with the dignity that had defined her reign. "I think we've said enough for tonight. However, Sophia, I want you to understand that your actions reflect not only on yourself, but on the entire institution of the monarchy. I hope you'll give serious consideration to the points I've raised." Sophia stood as well, her posture straight, but her eyes bright with unshed tears of frustration. "I understand your concerns, Your Majesty, but I also hope you'll consider that the monarchy's greatest threat may not be change, but irrelevance." After the Queen departed, Alexander and Sophia remained in the drawing room, the weight of unspoken tensions filling the space between them. The prince moved to the window, gazing out at the palace gardens where security lights illuminated the carefully manicured hedges. "This is becoming impossible," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love you both, but I don't know how to bridge this divide." Sophia joined him at the window, slipping her hand into his. "I never wanted to cause problems for your family, Alex. But I can't pretend to believe in something I don't. When I married you, I thought I could make a difference, that I could use this platform to help people who don't have a voice. Alexander squeezed her hand, understanding the sincerity of her convictions even as he struggled with their implications. My mother isn't wrong about the dangers of political involvement. Look at what happened to monarchy in other countries when they lost public support. But look at what's happening to monarchies that refuse to evolve, Sophia replied. Young people see us as irrelevant relics. If we don't stand for something meaningful, what's our purpose? The question echoed in the quiet room, encompassing not just their personal conflict but the broader challenges facing modern monarchy. Outside, the palace grounds stretched into darkness, symbolizing both the tradition that had sustained the royal family and the uncertain future that lay ahead. As they finally made their way to their private quarters, neither Alexander nor Sophia could have anticipated how much more complicated their situation was about to become. The morning papers would carry Sophia's humanitarian statements prominently, and the public reaction would force the royal family to confront questions they had been hoping to avoid. The seeds of a crisis that would test the very foundations of their relationships, and their institution had been planted in the elegant drawing room where generations of royals had gathered to discuss the affairs of state. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the careful balance that Isabella had worked so hard to maintain would face its greatest test yet. The morning sun cast long shadows across the breakfast room as Queen Isabella reviewed the stack of newspapers that Lady Margaret had arranged beside her coffee cup. The headlines were exactly what she had feared, and worse. Princess calls for open borders, screamed the Daily Herald, while the more conservative Royal Times ran with royal family divided on immigration policy. The photographs showed Sophia in animated conversation at the gala, her expressive gestures frozen in moments that suggested passionate advocacy rather than diplomatic restraint. Isabella's breakfast of fresh fruit and toast remained untouched as she absorbed the full scope of the media reaction. Editorial writers were already weighing in, with some praising Princess Sophia's humanitarian stance, while others questioned whether the royal family was overstepping constitutional boundaries. The comment sections of online articles revealed a public deeply divided, with supporters and critics of the monarchy's traditional neutral stance engaging in heated debates. Lady Margaret entered quietly, carrying additional briefing papers and wearing the grim expression that Isabella had learned to associate with political crises. At this early hour, Margaret's usually perfect composure showed signs of strain, her silver hair slightly disheveled for what had obviously been a sleepless night spent managing the palace's response to the media storm. "Your Majesty," Margaret began, settling into her usual chair across from the Queen, "the Prime Minister's office has already called twice this morning. They're requesting clarification on the royal family's position regarding immigration policy, and the opposition leader has issued a statement saying Princess Sophia's comments represent a dangerous politicization of the monarchy." Isabella set down her newspaper with deliberate care, her expression thoughtful but controlled. The constitutional implications of Sophia's statements were indeed serious. The royal family's political neutrality wasn't merely a matter of tradition. It was fundamental to their role in the democratic system. By appearing to advocate for specific policy positions, Sophia had inadvertently stepped into a constitutional minefield. "What's the palace's official response so far?" Isabella inquired, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "We've issued a standard statement emphasizing that Princess Sophia was speaking in her capacity as a humanitarian advocate, not as a representative of official royal policy. However, the distinction appears to be lost on much of the media and the public." Before Isabella could respond, Prince Alexander appeared in the doorway, still wearing yesterday's formal shirt but with his jacket and tie abandoned somewhere along the way. His hair was disheveled, and the dark circles under his eyes suggested he had spent the night in heated discussions with his wife rather than sleeping. "Mother," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue, "we need to talk about what happened last night, and more importantly, what's going to happen today." Isabella gestured for him to join them, while Margaret discreetly prepared another cup of coffee. The prince slumped into a chair with none of his usual ceremonial bearing, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of exhaustion that made him look more like a troubled husband than a future king. "Sophia is devastated," Alexander began, accepting the coffee gratefully. "She feels like she's been misunderstood and misrepresented, but she also maintains that she said nothing wrong. She believes the royal family has a moral obligation to speak out on humanitarian issues." Isabella studied her son's face, recognizing the toll that the conflict was taking on him personally. Alexander had always been sensitive to others' emotions, a quality that made him empathetic but sometimes indecisive in political situations. The division between his loyalty to his mother and his love for his wife was clearly causing him significant distress. "Where is Sophia now?" Isabella asked, genuinely concerned despite her frustration with her daughter-in-law's actions. "In our private study, drafting a statement she wants a release to clarify her position. I tried to convince her to wait, to let the palace communications team handle the response, but she's determined to speak for herself." This news caused both Isabella and Margaret to exchange alarmed glances. An uncoordinated response from Sophia could potentially make the situation even worse, particularly if her statement doubled down on the controversial positions that had created the crisis in the first place. Margaret leaned forward urgently. "Your Majesty, if I may suggest, perhaps we should invite Princess Sophia to join this conversation. It's crucial that we present a unified approach to this crisis." Isabella nodded, recognizing the wisdom of Margaret's suggestion despite her own reluctance to continue the previous night's confrontation. Alexander rose to fetch his wife, leaving the Queen and her advisor to contemplate the delicate negotiations that lay ahead. When Sophia entered the breakfast room 10 minutes later, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had spent years in diplomatic circles. But Isabella could see the strain in her daughter-in-law's carefully controlled expression. Sophia had changed into a conservative navy suit, and her hair was pulled back in a style that emphasized her serious demeanor. She carried a folder containing what Isabella assumed was the statement she had been preparing. "Your Majesty, Lady Margaret," Sophia said formally, taking her seat with the precise movements of someone operating under significant stress. "I appreciate the opportunity to discuss last night's events." Isabella poured tea for Sophia, using the familiar ritual to buy herself a moment to choose her words carefully. The Queen understood that this conversation would likely determine not only the immediate resolution of the crisis, but also the long-term dynamics within the royal family. "Sophia, I want you to understand that my concerns last night weren't personal criticisms. The issues you raised are important ones, and your passion for humanitarian causes is admirable. However, the manner in which you expressed your views has created significant complications for the monarchy as an institution." Sophia opened her folder and withdrew several sheets of paper covered in her neat handwriting. "I've been thinking about that all night, Your Majesty. I've drafted a response that I believe addresses the constitutional concerns while maintaining the integrity of my humanitarian commitments." She handed copies of her draft statement to Isabella, Alexander, and Margaret, then waited anxiously as they read her carefully crafted words. The statement attempted to walk a fine line between clarifying her position and avoiding any appearance of retreat from her principles. Isabella read slowly, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Sophia's statement was well-written and diplomatically phrased, but it still contained language that could be interpreted as advocacy for specific policies. The princess had attempted to frame her comments as expressions of personal values rather than political positions, but Isabella doubted whether such distinctions would satisfy the critics who were already questioning the royal family's constitutional role. "This is thoughtfully written," Isabella said finally, "but I'm concerned that any statement from you at this point might inadvertently fuel further controversy. The wisest course might be to allow the initial storm to pass, while we develop a more comprehensive strategy for addressing these issues." Sophia's careful composure cracked slightly, revealing the frustration that she had been struggling to contain. "Your Majesty, with respect, remaining silent will be interpreted as either an admission that I was wrong or a sign that the royal family doesn't care about humanitarian issues. Either interpretation damages our credibility and moral authority. Margaret intervened diplomatically, recognizing that the conversation was moving toward another confrontation. Perhaps we could explore alternative approaches, ways for Princess Sophia to demonstrate her commitment to humanitarian causes without making explicit policy statements. Alexander seized on this suggestion eagerly. Sophia could increase her patronage activities with refugee assistance organizations. Actions rather than words might be more effective in the long run. But Sophia shook her head firmly. Ribbon-cutting ceremonies and photo opportunities aren't enough anymore. People expect authentic engagement from public figures, especially those in positions of privilege and influence. If we only offer symbolic gestures, we risk being seen as out of touch with the real struggles that people face. Isabella felt her patience beginning to fray despite her efforts to remain diplomatic. The Queen had spent decades learning to navigate the complex balance between personal convictions and constitutional requirements, and Sophia's apparent unwillingness to accept similar constraints felt like a rejection of everything Isabella had worked to preserve. "Sophia," Isabella said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "the monarchy's influence comes from its ability to remain above partisan politics. The moment we become identified with specific political positions, we lose our effectiveness as unifying symbols for the entire nation. This isn't about avoiding difficult issues. It's about understanding our constitutional role. But what if our constitutional role is no longer sufficient for the challenges we face?" Sophia responded, her own voice rising with passion. "What if the people need more from their leaders than symbolic unity? What if remaining neutral in the face of injustice actually undermines our moral authority?" The question hung in the air, touching on fundamental tensions that have been building within the monarchy for years. The rise of social media and the increasing politicization of public discourse had made traditional royal neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. Young people especially seem to expect their leaders, including royals, to take clear stands on moral issues. Alexander looked between his mother and wife, recognizing that their fundamental disagreement went far deeper than questions of protocol or media strategy. They represented different visions of what the monarchy should be in a modern world, and he was increasingly uncertain about which vision was correct. The meeting continued for another hour, but little progress was made toward resolving the central conflict. Isabella insisted that Sophia's statement should be withdrawn and replaced with a more neutral response crafted by the palace communications team. Sophia maintained that any retreat from her humanitarian commitments would represent a betrayal of her principles and would damage her credibility with the causes she supported. As tensions escalated, Margaret suggested a temporary compromise. Sophia would delay releasing her statement for 24 hours, during which time the palace communications team would work with her to develop language that addressed her concerns while minimizing constitutional complications. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it provided breathing space for all parties to consider their positions more carefully. However, the reprieve would prove shorter than anyone anticipated. As the morning progressed, new developments began to emerge that would transform the crisis from a family disagreement into a full-scale constitutional confrontation. Opposition politicians were beginning to demand parliamentary debates about the royal family's role, and protest groups were organizing demonstrations both in support of and opposition to Princess Sophia's statements. By noon, it became clear that the 24-hour delay might not be sufficient to contain the growing controversy. The story had taken on a life of its own, with international media beginning to pick up the narrative and frame it as a fundamental challenge to the British constitutional system. Isabella stood at the window of her private office, looking out at the protesters who had begun to gather at the palace gates. Some carried signs supporting Princess Sophia's humanitarian stance, while others demanded that the royal family return to its traditional neutrality. The sight of her subjects divided over her family's internal conflicts filled the Queen with a deep sense of foreboding about the challenges that lay ahead. The emergency meeting in the throne room had been called for 3 o'clock, but by 2:30, The key players were already assembled around the massive oak table that had witnessed centuries of royal deliberations. Queen Isabella sat at the head, her posture reflecting the weight of constitutional crisis that had escalated far beyond anyone's expectations. The morning's relatively contained media storm had exploded into a full-scale political confrontation that threatened the very foundations of the monarchy. Prime Minister James Morrison had arrived with his senior advisors, their grim expressions reflecting the severity of the situation. At 45, Morrison was a pragmatic politician who had maintained a respectful working relationship with the royal family throughout his 3 years in office. However, the pressure from both his own party and the opposition was forcing him into an increasingly difficult position regarding the constitutional implications of Princess Sophia's statements. "Your Majesty," Morrison began, his typically confident demeanor subdued by the gravity of the circumstances, "I'm afraid the situation has deteriorated significantly since this morning. The opposition has tabled a motion for emergency debate in Parliament questioning whether Princess Sophia's statements constitute a breach of constitutional convention. Moreover, 3 Commonwealth realms have requested clarification about the royal family's official positions on immigration policy." Lady Margaret, seated to Isabella's right, had spent the morning fielding calls from constitutional experts, foreign diplomats, and senior civil servants. Her usually pristine appearance showed signs of strain, and the stack of briefing papers before her had grown to intimidating proportions. The crisis was no longer merely a matter of media management. It had evolved into a fundamental challenge to the constitutional settlement that governed the relationship between the monarchy and democratic government. Prince Alexander entered the room accompanied by Princess Sophia, and the tension immediately became palpable. Sophia had spent the afternoon meeting with representatives from various humanitarian organizations who had rallied to support her statements. Their encouragement had strengthened her resolve, but it had also intensified her conflict with the palace's official position. Isabella observed her daughter-in-law carefully as they took their seats. Sophia's bearing remained dignified, but there was a new determination in her posture that suggested the events of the past day had hardened rather than softened her position. The princess carried herself like someone who had made a decision and was prepared to face the consequences. "Before we begin," Isabella said, her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades on the throne, "I want everyone to understand the gravity of our situation. This is no longer simply a matter of family disagreement or media management. The constitutional issues raised by yesterday's statements have created a crisis that threatens the stability of the monarchy itself." Morrison nodded gravely. "Your Majesty is quite correct. I've spoken with constitutional scholars, and there's genuine concern that Princess Sophia's statements could be interpreted as the royal family attempting to influence government policy. While the statements themselves may seem benign, the precedent they set is potentially dangerous." Sophia had remained silent during these preliminaries, but now she leaned forward with the controlled intensity of someone who had spent years negotiating complex international agreements. "Prime Minister, with respect, I believe there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what occurred yesterday evening. I was speaking as a humanitarian advocate about moral imperatives that transcend partisan politics. Surely there's a difference between advocating for basic human dignity and taking positions on specific government policies." The Prime Minister's response was diplomatic but firm. "Princess Sophia, while I understand and even admire the sentiments behind your statements, the constitutional framework doesn't easily accommodate such distinctions. The royal family's political neutrality isn't simply a matter of tradition. It's essential to maintaining public confidence in democratic governance." Alexander, who had been listening with increasing distress, finally spoke up. "Isn't there some way to resolve this without requiring Sophia to completely abandon her humanitarian commitments? Surely we can find a path that respects both constitutional requirements and moral imperatives." Lady Margaret consulted her notes before responding. "We've explored various compromise positions, Your Royal Highness, but each option carries significant risks. Any statement that attempts to clarify Princess Sophia's position inevitably raises questions about the royal family's role in political discourse. The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with various advisors presenting different scenarios and their potential consequences. The consensus that emerged was deeply troubling. There appeared to be no easy resolution that would satisfy both constitutional requirements and Sophia's principal positions. Every compromise seemed to involve either a retreat from important humanitarian principles or an acceptance of constitutional precedents that could prove dangerous in the future. As the meeting progressed, it became increasingly clear that Sophia was facing a choice between her role as a member of the royal family and her commitment to humanitarian advocacy. The realization of this stark dilemma began to affect everyone in the room, as they grappled with the implications for both the monarchy and the individual involved. Isabella had been observing these dynamics with growing concern. She recognized that forcing Sophia to choose between her principles and her royal duties would likely result in a decision that could damage the family permanently. However, she also understood that allowing the constitutional crisis to continue would undermine the monarchy's long-term viability. During a brief recess, Isabella requested a private conversation with Sophia. They withdrew to a smaller adjacent chamber, leaving the others to continue their discussions. The Queen's private study was more intimate than the formal meeting room, filled with personal photographs and mementos that reflected her long reign and deep family connections. "Sophia," Isabella began, her voice softer than it had been during the formal meeting, "I want you to know that I respect your convictions. Your passion for helping others is admirable, and in different circumstances, I would encourage you to pursue those interests fully." Sophia looked directly at the Queen, her expression revealing both gratitude for the acknowledgement and sadness about the impossible situation they faced. "Your Majesty, I've spent the last 24 hours questioning every decision that led to this moment. I never intended to create problems for the family or the institution. But I also can't pretend to believe that remaining silent about humanitarian crises is the right thing to do." Isabella moved to the window, gazing out at the palace gardens where protesters continued to gather in growing numbers. Some carried signs supporting Sophia's stance, while others demanded a return to traditional royal neutrality. The sight of her subjects divided over her family's internal conflicts reinforced the gravity of the constitutional crisis they faced. The monarchy has survived for centuries by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character, Isabella said thoughtfully. But adaptation requires wisdom about which changes strengthen the institution and which ones threaten its foundations. "I'm genuinely uncertain about which category your humanitarian advocacy falls into." This admission surprised Sophia, who had expected another lecture about tradition and constitutional constraints. The Queen's willingness to acknowledge uncertainty created an opening for a different kind of conversation about the challenges facing modern monarchy. "Your Majesty, I believe the greatest threat to the monarchy isn't change, but irrelevance. Young people increasingly see traditional institutions as disconnected from the real issues that affect their lives. If we don't demonstrate genuine engagement with moral questions, we risk losing the respect and support that sustain the monarchy." Isabella turned back to face her daughter-in-law, recognizing the sincerity and intelligence behind Sophia's arguments even as she wrestled with their implications. "But if we become associated with partisan political positions, we also risk losing our ability to serve as unifying symbols for the entire nation. The challenge is finding ways to demonstrate moral leadership without compromising constitutional neutrality." Their private conversation was interrupted by Alexander's arrival with news that would further complicate an already difficult situation. Several major humanitarian organizations had issued a joint statement supporting Princess Sophia's position and calling on the royal family to maintain its moral leadership on humanitarian issues. Simultaneously, conservative political groups were organizing counter-demonstrations demanding that the royal family return to strict constitutional neutrality. The external pressures were intensifying the internal family crisis, creating a dynamic that threatened to spiral beyond anyone's control. Isabella realized that they were approaching a moment of decision that could fundamentally alter the monarchy's relationship with British society and democratic governance. When they returned to the main meeting, Prime Minister Morrison presented new information that added urgency to their deliberations. Your Majesty, I've just received word that the opposition intends to use tomorrow's parliamentary session to introduce a formal motion questioning Princess Sophia's constitutional role. If the motion passes, it could force a broader review of the monarchy's place in the constitutional system. The implications of this development were immediately apparent to everyone in the room. A parliamentary motion questioning a member of the royal family would create a precedent that could be used to challenge the monarchy's independence and traditional prerogatives. The crisis had evolved from a family disagreement into a potential constitutional confrontation between the monarchy and elected government. Sophia listened to these developments with growing alarm. Finally, understanding how her humanitarian statement had created consequences far beyond anything she had intended. The princess found herself at the center of a constitutional crisis that could damage not only her own position, but the entire institution of monarchy. "I think," Sophia said quietly, her voice barely audible in the formal chamber, "I need to seriously consider whether my continued role as a member of the royal family is compatible with my commitment to humanitarian advocacy." The words fell into silence as everyone in the room grasped their significance. Sophia wasn't simply talking about modifying her public statements or accepting constraints on her advocacy. She was contemplating a fundamental choice between her marriage into the royal family and her principles as a humanitarian advocate. Alexander's face went pale as he realized what his wife was suggesting. The prince had been hoping for a compromise that would allow Sophia to maintain both her royal role and her humanitarian commitments, but the escalating crisis was forcing choices that seemed to preclude middle ground. Isabella felt a deep sadness as she contemplated the possibility of losing her daughter-in-law, not through any personal animosity, but through the inexorable logic of constitutional constraints. The Queen had genuinely grown to appreciate Sophia's intelligence and passion, even when disagreeing with her methods. As the meeting concluded with no clear resolution, all parties understood that the next 24 hours would likely determine not only Sophia's future, but the direction of the monarchy itself. The crisis had reached a point where traditional solutions seemed inadequate, and entirely new approaches would be needed to navigate the constitutional and personal challenges they faced. The dawnlight filtering through the ancient windows of Windsor Castle found Queen Isabella in her private study, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries of royal correspondence and constitutional documents. She had spent the sleepless night reviewing precedents from previous constitutional crises, searching for guidance that might help resolve the impossible situation facing her family and the monarchy itself. Lady Margaret arrived at 6:30 with the morning papers, her expression grim as she carried what had become a daily burden of increasingly dramatic headlines. The crisis had dominated the front pages for 3 consecutive days, with editorial writers and constitutional experts offering contradictory analyses of the royal family's predicament. International media had begun framing the story as a fundamental test of whether modern monarchy could adapt to contemporary expectations of political engagement. "The parliamentary debate is scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon," Margaret reported, setting down a folder containing the latest political intelligence. "The Prime Minister's office indicates that the government will attempt to defend the royal family's constitutional position, but they're facing significant pressure from both the opposition and their own backbenchers." Isabella nodded wearily, understanding that the government support, while welcome, might not be sufficient to prevent lasting damage to the monarchy's constitutional standing. The debate would force Parliament to examine fundamental questions about the royal family's role that had remained comfortably ambiguous for decades. Prince Alexander entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the haggard expression of someone who had spent the night in difficult conversations. He had been with Sophia until the early morning hours, trying to find some resolution that would allow their marriage to survive the constitutional crisis while preserving both her principles and the monarchy's stability. "How is Sophia?" Isabella asked, accepting the coffee gratefully and noting the strain evident in her son's appearance. "She's drafting a statement," Alexander replied, slumping into a chair with none of his usual formal bearing. "Not the kind we've been discussing with the communications team. Something more fundamental." Isabella felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. She had spent the night hoping that additional time for reflection might lead Sophia toward a compromise position, but Alexander's tone suggested that the opposite had occurred. "She's decided to request a formal meeting with you this morning," Alexander continued. "She says she's found a way to resolve the crisis that respects everyone's positions, but I'm not sure you're going to like her solution." Before Isabella could respond, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Princess Sophia herself. The young woman entered with the composed dignity that had characterized her diplomatic career, but Isabella could see the emotional toll of the past days in the slight tremor of her hands and the determined set of her jaw. Sophia carried a single sheet of paper, neatly typed and bearing her personal seal. She handed it to Isabella without preliminary conversation, then stepped back with the formal posture of someone delivering an official communication rather than participating in a family discussion. Isabella read the document slowly, her expression carefully neutral despite the shock of its contents. Sophia had drafted a formal request to renounce her royal titles and withdraw from all official duties associated with the monarchy. The statement explained her decision as necessary to resolve the constitutional crisis, while allowing her to continue her humanitarian work without creating conflicts for the royal family. "Sophia," Isabella said finally, setting down the paper with deliberate care, "this isn't what any of us wanted. Surely there must be some alternative that doesn't require such a drastic step. Your Majesty, I've spent 3 days looking for alternatives, and I've concluded that half measures will satisfy no one," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion underlying her words. "If I remain a member of the royal family while continuing my humanitarian advocacy, the constitutional questions will persist. If I abandon my advocacy to conform to royal protocols, I betray everything I believe in." Alexander had been listening with growing distress, and now he stood abruptly, pacing to the window with barely controlled agitation. "There has to be another way. We can't let constitutional technicalities destroy our family." "Alex," Sophia said gently, turning to face her husband, "this isn't about constitutional technicalities. It's about fundamental incompatibilities between my role as a humanitarian advocate and the constraints of royal life. I should have recognized this before we married, but I thought I could find a way to serve both causes effectively." Isabella studied her daughter-in-law carefully, recognizing the sincerity of her convictions while also understanding the broader implications of her decision. Sophia's withdrawal from royal duties would send a message to the public about the monarchy's inability to accommodate different perspectives on moral leadership. However, forcing her to remain in a role that violated her principles would be equally damaging to the institution's credibility. "Before we make any final decisions," Isabella said diplomatically, "I'd like you to consider one more alternative. What if we created a new role for you, one that allowed humanitarian advocacy while maintaining clear separation from constitutional functions?" The suggestion sparked interest from both Sophia and Alexander, offering a potential compromise that neither had previously considered. Isabella had spent part of the night researching precedents for royal family members who had pursued independent careers while maintaining their family connections. "The precedent exists," Isabella continued, warming to the possibility of a solution that might preserve both family unity and constitutional propriety. "We could establish a formal humanitarian foundation under your leadership with clear independence from royal constitutional functions. You would maintain your title, but operate with complete autonomy in your advocacy work." Sophia considered this proposal carefully, recognizing its potential benefits while also understanding its limitations. That might address the constitutional concerns, but it could also be seen as a token gesture designed to contain rather than genuinely support humanitarian advocacy. Lady Margaret, who had been listening intently to this discussion, intervened with a practical perspective that had made her invaluable to the monarchy for decades. Princess Sophia, any solution that allows you to continue your humanitarian work while preserving family unity deserves serious consideration. The perfect should not become the enemy of the good. The conversation continued for another hour, with all parties exploring the practical details of establishing an independent humanitarian foundation. The structure would need to demonstrate genuine autonomy while maintaining sufficient connection to the royal family to provide credibility and resources for effective advocacy. As they worked through these details, news arrived that would add urgency to their deliberations. The parliamentary debate had been moved forward to accommodate international media attention, and early reports suggested that the opposition had gained additional support for their motion questioning Princess Sophia's constitutional role. Prime Minister Morrison arrived at the palace shortly before noon, carrying the latest political intelligence and a formal request from Parliament for clarification of the royal family's position. The government's ability to defend the monarchy in the debate would depend significantly on the palace's response to the constitutional questions that had been raised. Your Majesty, Morrison said, settling into a chair with the weary demeanor of a politician managing multiple crises simultaneously, I need to understand the family's final position before I address Parliament this afternoon. The debate will likely focus on fundamental questions about the monarchy's role in democratic governance. Isabella looked around the room at the faces of people who had become central to her life and reign. Alexander's obvious distress, Sophia's principled determination, Margaret's loyal concern, and Morrison's political pragmatism all reflected different aspects of the crisis they faced together. Prime Minister, Isabella said finally, I believe we've found a solution that addresses the constitutional concerns while respecting Princess Sophia's humanitarian commitments. We propose to establish an independent foundation that will allow her to continue her advocacy work with complete autonomy from royal constitutional functions. Morrison's expression brightened considerably as he grasped the implications of this proposal. An independent foundation would provide clear separation between Sophia's humanitarian work and the royal family's constitutional role, potentially resolving the crisis without requiring anyone to abandon their fundamental principles. That could work very well, Morrison said, already considering how to present this solution to Parliament. If the foundation's independence is clearly established, it should address the constitutional concerns while demonstrating the royal family's continued commitment to humanitarian causes. Sophia had been listening to these discussions with growing hope that a genuine compromise might be possible. The foundation structure would allow her to pursue her humanitarian advocacy without creating ongoing constitutional difficulties for the royal family. I would want complete editorial independence for the Foundation's positions and statements, Sophia said, outlining her requirements for accepting the proposed solution, and sufficient resources to support meaningful humanitarian projects rather than just symbolic gestures. Isabella nodded, recognizing that genuine independence and adequate resources would be essential for the Foundation's credibility. Those conditions seem entirely reasonable and necessary for the Foundation's success. The emergency session of Parliament that afternoon heard Prime Minister Morrison present the royal family's solution to the constitutional crisis. The establishment of an independent humanitarian foundation with Princess Sophia as its head was generally well received by members of all parties, providing a face-saving resolution that respected both constitutional requirements and humanitarian principles. Over the following months, the Sophia Foundation for International Humanitarian Aid would become one of the most respected advocacy organizations in Europe, addressing refugee crises, human rights violations, and social justice issues with the independence and resources that Sophia had always sought. Her work would demonstrate that meaningful humanitarian advocacy was possible within the broader framework of royal family connections, establishing a new model for royal engagement with contemporary moral challenges. Queen Isabella would later reflect that the crisis, while painful at the time, had ultimately strengthened both the monarchy and her family relationships. Sophia's foundation became a source of genuine pride for the royal family, demonstrating their continued relevance to contemporary moral leadership while respecting constitutional boundaries. Prince Alexander found that his wife's independence and humanitarian work actually enhanced their marriage, as Sophia was able to pursue her passions without the frustrations that had previously strained their relationship. Their partnership became a model for modern royal marriages that balanced traditional duties with individual fulfillment. The constitutional crisis had forced the royal family to confront fundamental questions about their role in modern democratic society. The solution they developed became a precedent for other monarchies facing similar challenges, demonstrating that adaptation and innovation could preserve essential traditions while accommodating changing social expectations. As Isabella stood in the palace gardens one evening 6 months later, watching Sophia address a group of international humanitarian leaders about the Foundation's work, the Queen felt a deep satisfaction that they had found a path through the crisis that honored everyone's principles while strengthening the monarchy for future generations. The protesters who had once gathered at the palace gates had long since dispersed, replaced by visitors who came to learn about the innovative approach to royal humanitarian engagement that had emerged from the crisis. The constitutional questions that had once seemed so threatening had been resolved through creativity and mutual respect, demonstrating the monarchy's continued ability to evolve while preserving its essential character. The royal family had learned valuable lessons about the importance of communication, compromise, and the need to balance tradition with contemporary moral leadership. Most importantly, they had discovered that apparent conflicts between constitutional requirements and humanitarian principles could be resolved through innovative thinking and genuine commitment to finding solutions that respected all parties' core values.